stunned. I mean, I thought maybe I didn't hear this guy correctly. I said, You're telling me you loved Star Trek, the motion picture, came out in the early 1980s, better than Star Trek, the original series, better than Kirk and Spock, better than Star Trek, the Next Generation, Picard and Data?" And the guy said, "Yeah, that's what I'm telling you." And I said, "So just to satisfy my interest, which of those two things, of all the Star Trek series, and did you see first?" And he said, "Well, it was the movie. I hadn't seen any of the other television series. I went to see the movie, and then when I watched the series, it just didn't seem as exciting to me as the movie." Now, I think Star Trek, the motion picture, the first Star Trek movie, is okay, but I think it's generally and correctly recognized as not a very good motion picture. It was all right, not the greatest. Certainly doesn't hold a candle to Star Trek, the original series, or Star Trek, the Next Generation. None of those things, in fact, hold a candle to the original series. And that's what gave me the idea and the realization that it's not just saying which is aesthetically better, which works better. It has to do with what you first experienced. And after that, I noticed, when people were saying, "Well, which did you like better, Lord of the Rings, or back to Peter Jackson, his Lord of the Rings trilogy?" People who read Tolkien's novels always thought, well, Peter Jackson's works were good. They were good, but they were not great. And when it was the other way around, when people had seen the movies first and then went to read the novels, they thought the novels were excellent, but just didn't stand up to the movies and what they saw in the movies. So I think we have to consider that first love principle whenever we are trying to evaluate which is better, which does more or less. Because of that, I also noticed a very interesting thing, and this was really more recent, and that is that the adaptations which tended to get the most immediate love and adulation were those that made major changes from the original, so major that someone who loved the original could take the adaptation as something new and like and come to love it on its own terms. And so the question is, well, how much of a change do you have to make? Well, in my view, one of the best adaptations is the Amazon Prime television series, The Man in the High Castle, which of course is an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's award-winning novel, The Man in the High Castle. In my view, one of the best novels I've ever read. By the way, right up there with Dune and Foundation. I would highly recommend The Man in the High Castle. One of the reasons why I thought that was so successful is because the Amazon Prime Video presentation introduced a character, John Smith, who wasn't even in the original novel. And not only that, they got a brilliant actor to play that part, Rufus Sewell. And in fact, I interviewed Rufus Sewell. I was teaching a class from page to screen, similar to what I'm talking to you about right now, this past summer. And I was able to get Rufus Sewell through Zoom to come by my class, and we had a 90-minute interview. So you can just search for this on YouTube. And Sewell explains how when he sat down with Frank Spotnitz, who was the person who put the series together, they discussed how this new character would change the very nature of Philip K. Dick's book while attempting to be true to it. And I think it succeeded marvelously. Around the same time as Dune, the first part of the two-part movie debuted, and this is just in the last couple of months, another incredibly path-breaking science fiction series came to the screen. And as a matter of fact, in my view, I would say that the Dune series is the second best science fiction series, the book series, that I've ever read. So that's high praise. I probably read, I don't know, thousands of different stories. And I think that the Dune universe is a marvelous, brilliant, multifaceted, deeply layered universe with all kinds of different themes, ranging from faster than light travel by folding space to, the Bene Gesserit or Gesserit. I don't know to this day how to pronounce that, by the way. And the power of this group of women who in many ways control the destiny of many of the people in that story. So I think that Dune is in a class by itself, but I consider it the second best series because you might ask, what do I think was the first best series? That would be Isaac Asimov's Foundation series and the Foundation trilogy for a variety of reasons. And, since this isn't about Foundation, I'm not going to talk too much about Foundation, but I will say that for those of you who are interested in philosophy, the Foundation trilogy is the world's best science fiction for considering a profound philosophic issue, which is, if you could have knowledge of the future, if you, in effect, accepted the philosophy of de Lamartine, the French philosopher who said, the whole universe is like a clockwork organization. And if you could understand how it's ticking, you could predict where it's going to be a year from now, a decade from now, a millennium from now. That is a point of view that many scientists actually have. And in the Foundation trilogy, Isaac Asimov starts the trilogy by positing that here is this brilliant thinker, Harry Seldon, who is able to figure out how that universe is working, his so-called psychohistory, and predict where things are going. And in one of the most exciting parts of the Foundation trilogy, in the story called The General, here the old empire still is powerful, has an incredibly powerful general, attacks the Foundation, but the Foundation wins because it's in the right place at the right time. But not to give too much away, if you haven't read the Foundation, right after the general comes another character called the Mule, who's a mutation, not predictable, therefore, by Harry Seldon's history. And that changes things completely. So in terms of this philosophic question, if you have knowledge, what can you understand and what will you be unable to understand? There's no better story than the Foundation trilogy and the Foundation series. And by a stroke of good fortune, these two best, first best and second best, their visual presentations debuted at almost precisely the same time, just a couple of months ago. I mean, that's really amazing. There was no coordination between the two productions. It just happened that way. This, by the way, not to get too deeply into philosophy, but I'll just throw in here, this is another expression of what Hegel referred to as the spirit of an age. And as you may know, Hegel in his work said there are just times in history when certain forces come together and make a lot of things happen that are related to each other. So if you're studying the history of popular culture and art, for example, you notice that in the late 1800s, there was Impressionism, What was Impressionism? It was a kind of art. It was a kind of poetry. It was a kind of music. So you have Monet and Manet, that's art. You have impressionistic poets, and you have impressionistic music. Claude Debussy and his Afternoon of the Faun, beautiful impressionistic piece. So you have three different kinds of art, and they're all talking to us as human beings from a similar perspective through different media. And I think we're seeing a spirit of an age in terms of great science fiction coming to the screen. Now, I already mentioned The Man in the High Castle, so that wasn't precisely at the same time as Dune and Foundation, but it's certainly part of our time. Now, let's get back, though, more specifically to Dune for a few minutes. And Apple 1980s film versus the 21st movie, obviously. One of the problems bringing science fiction to the screen, and one of the problems that Dune specifically entailed, that is the bringing of Dune to the screen, is there is such a grandeur in the Dune story. Just think of like one scene, the wind-swept, sand-swept terrain of Dune, the immensity of that. And this is like, to cite another philosopher, Blaise Pascal, when the Pascal mused about the of the human being when we contemplate the grandeur of the cosmos. We're infinitesimal compared to that grandeur. Well, when you read Dune and you look at those sand-swept environments, not to mention the sandworm and all those things, there's an enormity there that you get when you're reading the words. But that's not easy to portray on the screen. And that's one of the reasons why I think the David Lynch movie, he gave it a good try, but they just didn't have the technology then to do it. But the 2021 movie did and does. And so one of the reasons why I think that's such a thrilling movie to see and so satisfying is that movie was up to the task of meeting the theater of the mind that all readers of Dune had. And it's interesting that, and here Dune becomes exceptional, different from The Man in the High Castle and different from Foundation, because it was so true to the original novel. And let me just fill in a detail there. I mentioned that The Man in the High Castle introduced the character of John Smith. Well, the Foundation first season, at least, they introduced something very new to Isaac Asimov's Foundation stories as well. In Isaac Asimov's Foundation stories, there was an emperor by the name of Cleon, one guy, an emperor. He set a lot of things in motion. But in the David Goyer television series, that one emperor becomes a triumvirate of clones. Brother Dawn, Brother Day, and Brother Dusk. If you haven't seen that, you don't know what I'm talking about. I won't give too much away in case you haven't seen it. I highly recommend it. But again, I think that Foundation succeeded, and it's just the first of, I think there are going to be 8 seasons of it, 10 episodes each. It broke the hold of the first love syndrome by putting something completely not in Isaac Asimov's story in that Dune, in that Foundation trilogy. Just as The Man in the High Castle did that with John Smith. Dune courageously didn't do that. they stuck very, very carefully to the original. So for people who, and anyone who's read the novel, they're waiting to see these things happen. And the way they happened was very, very satisfying and gratifying in the Dune movie. I'll just mention one more point, and then I could talk about this for hours, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about this. I just came across something very, very recently, and I thought of you, that is this conference, when I saw this, and you'll know why in a minute. Uh, the Foundation trilogy and the Foundation series was written by Isaac Asimov, who, in my view, because I put the Foundation series in first place, is the greatest science fiction writer in history. Better than H.G. Wells, better than Jules Verne, better than Philip K. Dick, better than Frank Herbert, even though those people are all superb. But in addition to the Foundation trilogy, Isaac Asimov also happened to write my favorite time travel novel, The End of Eternity. And I have to tell you, I'm the kind of person, when I really love something, uh, I try, if possible, to also create my own version of it. So I haven't yet written a Foundation trilogy or anything like Dune, but I have written a few time travel novels, The Plot to Save Socrates, and there are two sequels to that, Unburning, Alexandria, and Chronica. And every time I write anything with time travel, there's a part of my brain that is replaying The End of Eternity. That's how important that novel was to me. It was written in 1955. I read it when I was just an infant in 1959. I was a little older than an infant, but I was just really a kid. And I remember it blew my mind. I just loved it. Anyway, I discovered just recently that there was a Soviet adaptation of The End of Eternity made in 1987. And the first thing I thought when I saw something about that is, I said, oh, this can't be any good. Are you kidding? But nonetheless, you have to, and to get back to philosophy, as Kant said, Immanuel Kant, there are two parts to understanding. There's what your cognitive structures are, what you have in your head already, but then there's the confrontation of that with real experience. That's where knowledge comes from. So I had this idea that, hey, this is probably a ridiculous travesty of a movie. But I just saw the movie. It's in two parts. It's 2 hours long. It's on YouTube. So I don't know if YouTube is available in Poland. It's in Russian. I don't speak Russian, or certainly I don't read Russian, but they're pretty good English subtitles. And here's the point I'm making. Way back in 1987, this movie was made, and you know what? It is a surprisingly good movie. I didn't expect it to be good, and it did the same thing that the Dune movie did in 2021, that the Foundation series and The Man in the High Castle did not do. It told that story, The End of Eternity, that marvelous time travel story, completely by expressing the original. It didn't introduce new characters, didn't go in different directions. So I have to give that Soviet filmmaker credit. Even the acting was pretty good, by the way. So I'm just throwing that in there because I think that movie, The End of Eternity, the Soviet adaptation, Isaac Asimov, by the way, was born in Russia. I think back in 1920. It makes sense that there would be an affinity, any work of Isaac Asimov, and anything having to do with Russia. But they got it. They got it very well. I'm just like one point, in case any of you have read The End of Eternity and know the story, I won't give anything away, but one of the prime characters in that novel is the All When Council. Allwhen, all when. And they had that council in the movie. And I realized that the Soviets knew how to portray that because that council looked like a Politburo in the movie. The All When Council in that time travel movie felt very much like the Soviet Politburo, or what I know about it. I never witnessed it personally. If I ever got to the Soviet Union back in the old days, I probably would not have gotten out of there. They probably would have thrown me in some gulag. But the point is, I really give that movie credit, and I highly recommend it to all of you. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and happy to answer any of them.
Thank you, sir, for this marvelous production. We have a couple of questions for you. The first one is about the new series Foundation. And because the cast in this series was made much more multicultural, and also feminine figures appeared, because Asimov, who was writing in the specific age of Russia history, he was mostly just making it about this social, ethnical background. And how do you think this transposition made the great success of this interpretation possible?
I very much like that transition or transformation, and some of it was actually very clever as well. So in the original, the first Foundation novel, there was a character, Gal Dornick, who in the novel actually is a pretty minor character. He's like a boring mathematician. You don't really know much about him. He's almost just, he's what they call in writing an occasion for an info dump, meaning he just dumps information out there so we get it. In the Apple TV Plus rendition of that same story and that same character, they take the name Gal, which is spelled by Asimov Gaal, and they pronounce it Gal, which is fine with me, and they make it a woman character. And they do the same thing with Salvar Hardin, who was a man in the Foundation stories. And I think, and they do the same, and probably most significantly, with the robot character, who, by the way, Asimov liked blending his stories together. So in Asimov's robot stories, even independent of the Foundation, there was a robot by the name of R. Daniel Oliver. You can look up the spelling of that. Asimov took that character and put him into the Foundation stories later on in the 1980s and made the character Demerzel, which, you know, is a genderless name. So in the novel, and again, this came out in the 1980s, it was one of the prequels, Demerzel is a masculine robot. I mean, deep down, he's neither male nor female, but you know, the flesh that he has on, or whatever it is, makes him look like a man. Well, in the Foundation television series, the character is a woman, and very, very well played. So I like those changes. I just want to say one thing though, in Isaac Asimov's defense, he's often criticized as not giving women much of a role. But in the Foundation trilogy, there are a few women characters. Beta Darrell, for example, I mean, she saves the Foundation. So again, I don't want to give too much away. She is a major character. Her granddaughter, Arcady Darrell, plays a major role as well. And in the robot stories, the main intellect, the human being who understands the robots, is Susan Calvin. She's obviously a woman too. So in all fairness to Asimov, yeah, he was a product of his times. He tended to write male characters more than female characters, but he did have some female characters. By the way, I should mention, I'm not like Isaac Asimov when it comes to female characters. The heroine of The Plot to Save Socrates on Burning Alexandria and Chronica Trilogy is Sierra Waters, who is a graduate student, a young woman in New York in the 2040s. So I like writing women characters.
Uh, Thank you for this answer. And I would like to apologize for a mistake I made, because the conversation and the time for questions will be once again after the another prelection, which will be on the video. So we have more questions, and I would like to kindly ask you to stay with us and be till the end. Okay, once again, thank you for your time.
Right.
Okay, now it's time to introduce the other guest, but sadly couldn't make it in person to us today, but they were able to create the pre-recording of a presentation that we are going to watch right now. The presentation was made by Andrea Tortoro. He is a postdoctoral research in philosophy of mind in the University of Turin. And the title of his presentation is Temporary and Conspiracies in Herbert's World.
Okay. First of all, let me thank the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the possibility to present my work. The title of my talk is Temporary and Conspiracies in Herbert's World. Naturally, it is a really ambitious theme, and to say the truth,
Sir, because of technical difficulties with the presentation, we have time to ask you another question. There's a question about the theory of interpretation, because as you have made a point before, we can try to interpret a work of art as directly as we can, and the example can be the Russian version of End of Terminus. I suppose from what you have said, because I haven't yet heard about this movie. And the other way of making the interpretation is to make it as relevant as possible, which can be mainly seen with works of art that were made for previous generations. And here, I think the Foundation series is a great example. And the question is, do you think that there is a way to choose which particular approach should be taken in any particular example?
That's a great question. And let's look at the Foundation television series as an example. People have been trying to either make a movie of that or a television series for decades, and none of them succeeded. There were proposals, There were proposals that were accepted. There was even like hiring of producers, and they never came to pass. And the reason most people think is that the story itself was too complicated to make into a television series or a movie. So I hear somebody else talking. Is that okay? All right, I'll keep talking. Yeah, the so to answer the question, I think that David Goyer and the people who produced the Foundation television series made a deliberate decision. They said, because this Foundation story that Asimov gave us is so complicated and so complex and so many moving parts, we have to put things in there that people will instantly identify and instantly gravitate to and begin to get into the story through that. So I think, the idea of making Gal Dornick a woman, making Salvor Hardin a woman, making Demerzel a woman was a very exciting and daring concept. And that got people to pay more attention to the Foundation series. And the same thing is true with The Man in the High Castle. It's, Philip K. Dick is a difficult writer. I mean, near the end of his life, he pretty much almost lost his mind. And, there are a lot of complex things weaving through that novel, that wonderful novel. He brings in the I Ching, this like Asian mystical philosophy into an alternate history. And it's very easy to sort of lose your way in that story and not really get what's going on. In other words, in the novel, not to give too much away, the I Ching provides the path to seeing the difference between the alternate reality of the Axis, Germany and Japan won World War II, and our reality in which the Allies, the United States and England and the Soviet Union won World War II. So I think the people, and in particular Frank Spotnitz, who put together that package for the Amazon series, realized that because of the complexity of the story, it's so complex and so many different elements, that the best path forward is to have a character who didn't even exist in the novel, but such a powerful character, and get one of the best actors in the world to play that character, Rufus Sewell, that would make people take that story seriously. And I think that worked. Now, you may say about Dune, aren't there complex, things in Dune? Yes, there are many complex things in Dune. But I think, therefore, the people who made the 2021 version of Dune were very courageous in taking the complex story and saying, you know what, we're not going to change it. We're just going to see how it can work. They had more of a danger of not succeeding than did the Foundation people and the Man in the High Castle people. But in general, I think that's the complexity of the story is one way of making the decision. Are you going to introduce new characters? The End of Eternity, one of the reasons why the Soviet movie was so good, it's not that complex a story. It's basically a very straightforward story. There's a group of people, the Eternals, who figure out how to time travel, and they go up and down history, making things, quote, better, unquote, in their view. And one of their agents falls in love, with a beautiful woman. It's a very straightforward story. And he then does not want to follow what the Eternals want to do. So that's why the 1987 version of that story worked very well. It's a fairly straightforward story. And that's also, though, why the 1980s version of Dune, one of the reasons didn't work that well. Because again, they just didn't have the capacity to bring that complex story to the screen.
Okay, thank you very much for this answer. And I have information that we have a green light for the video presentation. So
First of all, let me thank the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my work. The title of my talk is not my main research theme. I'm a philosopher of mind in my academic activity, but I love so much science fiction novels, and I often use this kind of literature for philosophical purposes. I think science fiction is really useful in this sense. On the other hand, in philosophy, there is a long history of thought experiments, in particular in analytical tradition, inspired by science fiction, or the other way around, like the famous brains in a vat thought experiment from Hilary Putnam that inspired the amazing film Matrix. In any case, today I'm going to limit myself to provide some insight to reflect, trying to use Dune's word and fiction as a way to present some really important philosophical issues. So I'll try to show in some way how it is possible to practice philosophy from my perspective that, as I said, an analytical one, starting from Dune suggestions. There are naturally a lot of philosophical questions in Dune, like the relationship between environment and environmental resources and humankind, the role of political power, the role of religion, the consequences of artificial intelligence, and so on. But I want to start with this famous quote from God Emperor of Dune. In all of my universe, I have seen no law of nature unchanging and inexorable. This universe presents only changing relationships which are sometimes seen as laws by short-lived awareness. So in Dune universe, everything is constantly changing, is in a constant flux, like in Heraclitus' account where the world is the father of all things, and the only thing that is really permanent is change. So in Dune's world, there are no law of nature unchanging and inexorable, and if you must label the absolute as we see, you need to use its proper name, temporary. This is, philosophically speaking, a great and venerable problem. This question has both a metaphysical and a moral meaning. Let's start considering the metaphysical one. If reality is constantly changing, how is it possible that we and the things around us always remain identical to ourselves? Erwin Copy, in a famous book about logic, defined the problem of identity through time by noting that the following two statements both seem to be true, but also appear to be inconsistent. The first statement says if a changing thing really changes, there can't literally be one and the same thing before and after the change. And the second statement says, however, if there isn't literally one and the same thing before and after the change, then nothing has really undergone any change. So there seems to be something like a contradiction inside a temporary account of time. Traditionally, this puzzle has been solved in various ways. Aristotle, for example, distinguished between accidental and essential changes. Accidental changes are ones that don't result in a change in an object's identity after the same change, such as when an object is painted or our hairs become gray in time. Essential changes, by contrast, are those which don't preserve the identity of the object when it changes, such as when a house burns to the ground and becomes ashes, or when someone dies. So according to Aristotle, statement number one is completely false. The copy statement number one. A changing thing, in fact, can really change one of its accidental properties and yet literally remain one and the same thing before and after the change. All these considerations seem to be applicable to physical objects, but how are things when we consider personal identity? What is it for a person existing at one time to be identical to a person existing at another time? We perfectly know, in other words, that our body parts are temporary, like Dune's universe. The molecules of our body are constantly changing, as well as our external traits. My body is not the same as it was when I was a child, and it won't be the same in, 20 years. The problem was clearly posed by John Locke, the great empiricist, in his essay on human understanding. Locke distinguishes in this great book between being the same man and being the same person. To be the same man is to be the same member of the human species. But for Locke, what it is really crucial for being the same person is to have the same consciousness. So it's consciousness that has to remain the same. Consciousness is the set of thoughts of a person together with the recognition that those same thoughts belong to that person. Is a sort of understanding that what I am thinking now is thought by me, is a thought of mine. Okay. So we could say, following Locke, that personal identity consists in consciousness, and consequently a person remains the same person so long as that person possesses the same consciousness. Naturally, this idea brings memory in the foreground, because of memory is basically the connector that holds together the stream of consciousness of someone. Now, to show how really complex this puzzle can be, I consider an important moment of Dune saga. At a certain point, Jessica drinks the so-called water of life, a blue liquid with poison powers derived from the bile of a young sandworm, or something like this, used by the Bene Gesserit to turn their sisters into the Reverend Mother. In this way, Jessica received all of the tribe memories of her predecessors, called the other memory. So in this case, if we agree with Locke, Jessica consciousness is extended to, in some way, to incorporate the remembrances of her ancestors, and she is at the same time one and a multiple person, as you can see, personal identity and consciousness are really dense problem for philosophy, and probably also for Frank Herbert, I guess. And many solutions have been proposed in the history, in the great history of philosophy. I just gave you a really quick hint into these questions. Anyway, as I said, and as we saw with Jessica episode, personal identity is an issue in a temporary world, not only from a metaphysical point of view, as we saw, but also from a moral one. This is because it has to do with uncertainty and moral responsibility, a theme that is central in Dune, both for Paul Atreides and for Freeman, and men in general, we could say. Philosophically speaking, if we have a problem with identity, for instance, if we are not sure that Paul is the same person as the God Emperor, how can we ascribe moral responsibility to Paul for the actions of the God Emperor? So this is just to show the moral questions about uncertainty in personal identity. But I do not want to continue in this direction. What I want to emphasize is only that now, at this moment, is only that the world of Dune is a world that lives into the uncertainty. And what happens in an uncertain world? The first thing we can notice is that there is more space for what in today philosophy and psychology theories are called superstitious or magical thinking and confabulation. Superstitious or magical thinking is defined as seeing meaning, purpose, and agency where in fact there is none, or more of them, more of meaning, purpose, and agency where there is less. I also put in my slides some references, as you can see, to references to contemporary papers about these themes. The term confabulation comes from the Latin fabula, which means simply story. It refers to the fact that subjects in cases of confabulation seem to lack access to a piece of evidence relevant to the explanation of a given fact or event. But rather than admitting ignorance, they go on telling something, some sort of story indeed, about it. This doesn't happen only in clinical cases. Confabulations are not only ill-grounded, but we are really familiar with people who seem unable to say the words, I don't know, I simply don't know, and will quickly produce some sort of plausible sounding response to whatever they are asked. Well, these themes are really interesting in today's world. We could say that obviously today's social world is an enormous sounding board for this phenomena. But we can see that also in Dune, these attitudes are really useful. Attitudes to magical thinking or to confabulation. For instance, for Paul to become a tyrant, to build his religious myth, and to develop himself into the absolute and tyrannic God Emperor. This sort of way of thinking are for him a great instrument, if you want. on this basis, what can we learn? So about the second theme I'd like to expose to you, conspiracy theories. What we can learn about conspiracies? Well, first of all, we have to say that conspiracies that we can see at work in Dune are real conspiracies. And therefore, from this point of view, it is necessary to highlight that they are dissimilar in some way from what we mean when today we talk about conspiracy theories that are often something really speculative. But in any case, there is something that we can acquire and that even today is, we could say, suitable in some way. Firstly, that confabulations and their strongest model conspiracies are grounded on a particular kind of beliefs. So conspiracies like confabulation or magical thinking are grounded on a particular kind of beliefs which are not based on evidence or rational and inferential connections, but on emotional factors, like specifically the tendency to assemble representations, the main function of which is to satisfy our basic desires for purpose and control, always other contingent motivations. So particular kind of emotionally based beliefs, not rational beliefs. And we, from the tradition of pragmatism, we perfectly know that beliefs are the absolute motivational ground for actions, for our actions. Okay. Secondly, what we can learn. Secondly, that these theories are in essence forms of political or ideological propaganda. Their core function is to structure a political project based on mind control. And this is really evident in Dune's world. Both of these aspects are really clear in the description of Paul's aspiration for an absolute domination, for instance. He generates a sort of conspiracy to govern the entire galaxy, and, to say the truth, all the politics described in Dune is full of secret conspiracies that are able to direct the future course of human evolution, to create that force that, in Herbert's words that are so amazing and clear, is called plastic memory. What is plastic memory? It's the force that works beyond human consciousness and that trends the man to tribal, primitive, and feudal forms. That force, we could say, that I called probably uncertainty. So, thank you very much for the attention and again for accepting my work. Thank you very much. Okay. First of all, let me thank the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the thanks the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the thanks the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the thanks the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the thanks the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the thanks the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the thanks the organization of this wonderful event for having accepted my paper, giving me the thanks the organization.
Okay, that's the end of presentation. Okay, very interesting topic as well. That's the end of presentation. Okay, very interesting topic as well. Okay, sadly we cannot ask any questions to Prologant, but we have one last question to you, sir. Let me read it.
While you read, let me just say one quick thing. This previous speaker is like Harry Seldon in the foundation, right? Because you just like get like a hologram or a video of him talking, but you can't ask him any questions.
Exactly. Great point.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So you have said about Hegel's spirit of history, and I have a question about Hegel's dialectic, which makes its way back to foundation, because as you said, Harry Seldon, psychohistory, was a brilliant deterministic way of knowing exactly what will happen in the future, but there was a mutation which happened to make the previous predictions obsolete. And one way of understanding Hegel's dialectic is that we have thesis, an antithesis, and they together make the synthesis. So all movies are great. Titanic is not a very good movie. So most movies are great, but not Titanic. And the other way of understanding Hegel's dialectic is the way that was introduced mainly by Slavoj Žižek. And he interprets this philosophy as a dualistic philosophy of synthesis and antithesis, meaning that they cannot exist without one another. So to project it onto the idea of psychohistory, which was presented in Foundation, only because there was a mutation which made the predictions obsolete, the prediction was able to be made in the first place. And what do you think about this idea? That it was the only way that it could happen?
I have a few responses to that question. In the first place, I think Hegel's spirit of an age can be understood without any reference to the dialectic, synthesis, antithesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then the synthesis generates a new antithesis, etc. You don't need that as the explanation for why it is that in certain times in history, everything seems to come together in a cultural sense. And in fact, I don't know what the reason for that is. I think it's just enough to recognize it, meaning that popular culture is not just the haphazard thing that sometimes we think it is. It's not just something that's the result of very rich people coming up with enough money to finally make a series or a movie. Those are all factors, but there is something deeper in the culture and deeper in human beings and in our expression of cultures, which leads to this spirit of an age. And so that I think is an important thing to keep in mind. However, that said, I think, yes, in order for a thesis to be understood, you have to have an antithesis or an antithesis, because it's the antithesis which sheds light on the thesis and then makes it easier to understand, and in fact helps the thesis evolve into something new. And so in foundation, the mule indeed is the antithesis of the thesis Harry Seldon's psychohistory. And however, and that's a very exciting thing dramatically and in the narration, but it did not destroy psychohistory. It educated psychohistory. And that's why Asimov brilliantly puts into the novel, well, there's a second foundation. And the second foundation, in effect, comes into its own, achieves a position of prominence because it is the answer to the mule, not the original foundation. And that is a classic synthesis and a progression of knowledge and understanding. Or, in other words, psychohistory is not just Harry Seldon mapped out this future, and all you have to do is passively become aware of it, or maybe not even become aware of it. Everything is going to be okay as long as you follow the mathematical direction. That's what the original thesis was. But the antithesis of the mule shows that in order for psychohistory to have lasting impact, it has to be living. It can't just be Harry Seldon's mathematical equations. And so that's what the second foundation is for, a group of brilliant mathematicians who take Harry Seldon's equations and are constantly working them and figuring out where things are going to go. So I think in that sense, the foundation story does indeed capture Hegel's dialectic. By the way, let me throw one other thing in here. One of the things I hadn't mentioned is I've done a lot of work with Marshall McLuhan. And in fact, my 3 nonfiction books that have been translated into Polish, The Soft Edge, Cell Phone, and New Media, all deal heavily with Marshall McLuhan's work. McLuhan attempted to expand the 3-part dialectic into what he, McLuhan, called the tetrad, T-E-T-R-A-D, a 4-part structure about the impact that technologies have on our lives. And he thought that was a better way, a more accurate way of mapping out these changes. Even though I have been identified as a student and a proponent of McLuhan's work, I think the tetrad is very valuable, but I think you can have both Hegel's dialectic and McLuhan's tetrad. You don't need both. You don't need to have one or the other. In other words, it's like the first foundation and the second foundation. You really need the two of them. Let me also say, by the way, I'm going to put into the chat, assuming that I think this should do it. I just put a link in to a review. I was thinking about that Soviet movie, The End of Eternity, and I wrote a review actually just last night. So you can read my review in that link. And that also has a link to the YouTube 2-hour presentation of that 1987 movie, The End of Eternity. It also has links to my interview with Rufus Sewell, and it has links to a discussion I had with a group of reviewers about Foundation. So you might find that of interest. Last but not least, let me also mention to anyone who's listening to this, my Twitter handle is @PaulLev. That's PaulLev, @Paul Lev. I'll type that in here just so everyone has it. And if anybody has any questions after all this is over, feel free to tweet the questions to me. I always answer questions, and I'd always be happy to hear from you. So thank you for inviting me. I had a good time. I enjoyed Harry Seldon's lecture, even though we couldn't ask him any questions. And this is a good conference.
Hey, thank you greatly for your time and effort. And we are sorry for the inconveniences, but most of all, we are very happy that we have had you here with us. And thank you for all.
My pleasure. I know it's evening there in Krakow, so everybody have a good evening, have a good dinner, and I hope we somehow get in touch sometime in the future. Take care, everybody.
You too. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
And this was the final prelection of today. We would like to invite you for tomorrow's. And for now, we wish you a pleasant evening or rest of the day. And thank you for being here with us.